Good morning, good evening, good day, greetings and salutations. Welcome, I might add as well, to the Safe Room featuring Security Side Quest. My name is Tristan Watty, and I am joined by the marvelous, the mysterious, the marvel, the magnificent. I'll add that word today. Russ, how's it going?
Good. How are you doing on this marvelous Monday?
Yes, marvelous Monday. We'll add that to the catchphrase and the taglines because we're having fun today. So we're going to have a lot of fun, as I always like to say. But for you new joiners, for your first time joiners, or people who are just interested in knowing who we are, my name again is Tristan Watty. I come to you as a senior security consultant in the professional services organization of AWS, where we help to accelerate customers' journey to the cloud in a secure manner and fashion. And Russ, where are you coming from?
I come from the customer incident response team, where we help customers remediate and mitigate their incident response capabilities.
So Russ gets to have all of the fun, right? And
yeah, it's fun. There's a fire all the time. It's great.
Yeah. But we also like to know where everyone is tuning in from, when they're listening from, watching from, or just have luck. So feel free to put in the chat where you're tuning in from, as well as the next item, which is an interesting one. And that one is, what is your favorite winter food? And I zoom in for this to say, Russ, what is your favorite winter food? Last week we did summer food.
We did.
Now it's winter.
So I feel like there's going to be a very specific theme for winter. So I'm just going to start it off, and say I'm a big soup person. Winter is definitely soup or stew time. I'm going to have to go with one of my favorite soups is, the classic baked potato soup.
Baked potato soup. That sounds like a good choice. A hearty choice.
Yeah.
And before I reveal mine, I also say, greetings. Thank you for joining us. And Chantal oatmeal.
Ooh,
that is a good choice.
That's a good one.
Right?
That's a winter breakfast in my head. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, definitely. I never woke up in the summer like, let me get a hearty oatmeal.
Let me get some of that hot oatmeal in this morning.
Right, in 100-degree weather. But I think winter for me, like I was saying, I go hearty. I would go at mac and cheese. A good mac and cheese with a bunch of stuff in it, right? The bacon bits and all that kind of stuff. But I digress because we start to get hungry. So let's get back on course to saying, what are we doing today, Russ? Where are we focusing?
So last week, we went over our expedition into cloud network security. We're going to take it a little bit further. This week is our for the threats that come after. So it's our advanced network defense strategy episode. So we'll kind of go over a little bit of what we went over last week. So don't worry if you missed out. And then we'll try to actually get into the design and dig a little bit deeper than we did last week. So, no spoilers. We'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, we'll coast along with that piece. And if you get the theme, 10 billion points to you, as always, because the two episode titles are connected. Feel free to comment in the chat of how. But as Russ mentioned, advanced network defense strategies. So we touched upon some of the fundamentals last week of, okay, what's a security group? What's a NACL? But how do we piece all these together? Because there's going to be threats within your environment. How do you protect against it? How do you build that resiliency when it comes to security? And that's where the title comes in, the spoilers for the threats that come after. When you create everything, right? You want to have a continuous cycle of improvement. So what are the advanced network architecture designs that you need to consider within your environment? Because you have to think of, as we like to say, your cloud castle. You have to have the complete moats. You have to have the drawbridges, the secret passages. And that's when you start to put all of the different pieces together. Because just like any good medieval fortress, you want to make the neighboring town jealous, right? Because you have such great defenses that nobody wants to really challenge you. Because, hey, Cloud security walls are made of security groups, and the sentries are IDS systems or certain AWS services, which we'll get to. But if you want to take more of a different approach and go one step beyond, zero trust network implementation, that starts to go towards that line, right? And it's funny because I also want to say welcome to trust issues when you approach network security, when you think of zero trust.
Yeah.
Everything is loyal, but you want to make sure you trust but verify. So we get into talking a little about that, some hybrid network security, because think of hybrid as, hey, you have your old school home security system and you want to make it work seamlessly with your fancy new smart home gadgets. That's kind of where that hybrid approach comes in. And then lastly, serverless. What do we do with that? Containers, serverless, network security, all matches made on the good side of the fence. But the question we have to start off with, to open with, I think we start to go towards some of our, how should I say this? Polls. I was looking for the word. I was just like, I wanted to say something, but I was like, polls.
Hey, it works. So, we got it.
Yeah. So we have a theme going on, right? Mm-hmm. So it's an expedition. So what you want to do is shape your perimeter, because think of yourself setting up a camp in the middle of nowhere. You want to make sure that you have the secure network perimeter. So where do you go to first? 1, 2, 3, or 4. Feel free to put it in the chat. VPC security groups, NACLs, AWS WAF, VPC endpoint. Where does your mind go first, Russ?
Yeah, so I think that mine goes right to security groups. For me, I think of when I'm thinking of perimeter, I'm pretty much immediately thinking of the VPC, and so I'm thinking VPC security groups. Like that's my immediate first step. If we're setting up camp, like what's the first thing you do? It's like set guards. So yeah. Who can and cannot come in. So for me, that's what I think of first place.
So do you just do quad zeros all over the place, right? Yeah, it's just no.
Exactly. Yeah.
No, not at all. Please do not do quad zeros without the appropriate mechanisms in place, right? Because that's the equivalent, if you're camping, of leaving all your food out in the open and there's bears around, right? They're just gonna come into your camp. There's nothing stopping them. So if I were to pick and take a non-bear approach, I would start to go towards endpoints, because endpoints are one of those things when you start to build out your advanced network strategies of, hey, how do I kind of limit this, right? You have the S3, you have gateway endpoints, you have all these different items, right? You want to consider, and you could put policies on, and it starts to build up your overall, not even just network perimeter strategy, your data perimeter strategy, when you start to think of the endpoint usage. And Mohammed 2, 3, 1, and 4. Right? Just everything. It's like a buffet.
Yeah,
it's like
do all
everything. Yeah.
But that's actually a very interesting order that they put them in.
Yeah. So NACLs, and then WAF, and then security groups, and then endpoints. Yeah. Thanks for putting that in the chat. It gets you to think, because what I've often seen with different customers is, depending on who you're speaking to, if you're speaking to a developer or a network engineer or a security person, these orders kind of flip a little bit, right?
Yeah.
So this is what we like to do on this show, is have a direction that we kind of stick to, right? Is when we approach security, how do we
try?
Yeah, right. Stick to. I use stick to loosely, right? Surprisingly enough, but when you start to think about it, when you look at your overall network architecture design, right, you have to take that step back and say, what goes into, one, a network architecture design when it comes to AWS Cloud. Two, how do I improve the current one I have? Because as our title shows, it's for the threats that come after, right? You put the initial design into place. Now you have to take that step back and be like, all right, how can I improve this design? Right? It's like when you do the stick figure and you're like, okay, this is the best I got, but how can I make it better?
Yep.
So you add another stick figure and you're like, yeah, I have 2 now. But one of the places I would think to start with is creating logical network zones, right? Public versus private. So network zoning is crucial, especially within defense and depth, because a public zone hosts internet-facing resources with restricted access controls, while private zones contain sensitive systems with no direct internet access. That's an important distinction, right? Because you start to carve out your network design in such a manner that says, hey, these are publicly facing, so I have to add these specific controls in place, versus private, where I have to add and have different levels of controls. And what I mean by different is, hey, who's actually accessing from the inside of my network that needs to, right? So if you think of, I don't know, let's take a wild service like SageMaker notebooks, right? You have all these data scientists going into different notebooks. But what happens if they're in different departments? Do they have access to the same data? Can they access the same data? What happens if they're remote? So on and so forth. So I think, and what is your opinion on this when it comes to public versus private, Russ? How much have you seen on your side from the IR standpoint of considerations of keeping, public a little bit more secure because, hey, it's out in the open versus the inside?
Yeah, or sometimes the complete opposite, right? So if you're using, a public VPC to just host a website, you're not really as concerned about that, right? You're just going to let 443 pretty much and the HTTP open. And so, and then with your internal, might be a little bit stricter because, that's where some of the more critical or crucial data rests. But I think it's exactly how you explained it. But I kind of like to think of it as like it's like an intranet versus internet facing server, and try to keep that that mentality, but just knowing that it's a little bit less secure than an actual intranet, but kind of keeping that mentality, like what on premises do you keep in your intranet and what is internet facing. It's very, very similar determination in the cloud with your VPCs, just making sure that they are very clearly labeled what is public and what is not public.
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes you always have to take that step back and just try to figure out exactly what you were saying is the VPCs of, okay, how many VPCs? And that's another question, right, that organizations have, because as they grow within AWS, you're managing connections between numerous amount of VPCs, right? And then you also have services like transit gateways, which provide that hub and spoke approach. And when you start to build out your advanced network architecture, this is a real consideration, because having something like a transit gateway, it reduces configuration complexity, for lack of better words, right? Because it enables the consistency that you need across multiple VPCs. And when you have things like an intranet, right, who is accessing, where is it accessing from? And now when you have systems that are pulling from various data sources, it's very important to consider as well, right?
Yep.
So, and then we have a question, ports. No more, be more specific range, but open to all ports. No range take factor. Number range take factor. So if I were to see if I'm understanding this right, you're essentially saying it's better to be more specific than to open to all ports. And I would say and agree with that is yes. Because when you have multiple ports out there that you don't know are doing what task or why is it doing a task, then if somebody runs a port scan and says, hey, this is open, all right, it opens you to more of an attack surface, opposed to just having a restriction in place and very strict rules that go against it. So thank you for that. And I think that also leads us into talking about kind of setting up traffic inspection points as well, right? So when you're building out your advanced network design, you want to make sure that you have strategic inspection points in place that essentially allow comprehensive traffic analysis, right? Without creating bottlenecks, of course. But essentially what you want to have in place is different mechanisms that, depending on your network design, because you have centralized and decentralized approaches, you want to have traffic inspected, essentially, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you can use gateway load balancers and things of that nature, but you also want to make sure that you have a consistent security posture across your entire cloud footprint. So that's one consideration, as well as high availability. That's the last consideration I would say when you think of just the overall building of architecture, is how resilient is that architecture? How secure and resilient, right? People often think it's like, oh, is it resilient? I think secure and resilient, because that's the important part, because
two different things.
Yeah, exactly. Because a compromise in one AZ shouldn't affect your entire security posture. Right? Where are you sending all of your logs? Right? If this AZ goes down, are you still collecting and able to triage? And what does your TDIR strategy look like? Right? So where are your tools hosted? Do you have backups and things of that nature? And that's where that defense in depth and layered approach comes into play. So you want to make sure that you're planning, especially when it comes to, let's say, route tables and NACLs and security groups, that they have a failover in place, because that's a big part. Because how often have you seen, Russ, when when AZ goes down, then it's just like kind of down from there?
Yeah, I don't want to say a lot, but more than I should, for sure. Yeah. But yeah, it's a good point. Like you're talking about these considerations now, but I see them after they've already, not been considered by, the designer, but was considered by the threat actor. So, it's the little things that really add up into, and I think that's, we kind of do, say things with a little bit of a misnomer type of, maybe not even miscommunication, whatever. But, when we say advanced networking architecture and advanced, we're not really saying that like there's some advanced technique, ninjutsu that's going to like protect your networks. It's doing all of the basics really well, even at scale when you add that complexity. So, it's not like we're creating something that's, a secret mechanism. We're using everything at our disposal to think deeply about what it is we're trying to secure and how we can do that. So I guess I can kind of speak a little bit more to those things, such as like zero trust implementation and stuff like that. But I did want to just real quick clarify the terminology that we're using and kind of have us all on the same page before we go further, especially when we're talking about defense in depth and zero trust implementation, because they're such buzzwords. Yeah, exactly. It's exactly, yeah. And so yeah, they are buzzwords, right? But they're also important concepts. So just having that kind of clarity, why, we actually use these and implement these processes. So with zero trust, right? It's definitely a buzzword, but there's context behind it. Why, some of the older, castle and moat, like you were referring to earlier, where we're just doing perimeter security, why hasn't that been affected or effective, excuse me? Because when you're doing, perimeter security alone, you're not securing the networks, the endpoints, everything that we just discussed. And so, when we're talking about zero trust, we're doing the trust but verify. but in a bit of a different way, because there's zero trust, right? So it's not just trust but verify. It's we're not going to trust and we're still going to verify. And so it's really more of a, I don't want to say antagonistic, but it's definitely an aggressive approach towards security. I mean, if you picture it in like a real world example, right? You go out and you're like, okay, all of my employees, everyone that has access to anything on my information systems are now threats. They're enemies. And, you know, my employees have a certain level of access. My users have a certain level of access. You know, let's architect our security plan based off of that. What do our users have access to? And if they are a threat, then what can they do with that access? And try to, you know, try to force that you know, access request function. So that way you're really getting into validating each and every request, you know, not trusting any user or employee or workflow.
Yeah.
So it is a very aggressive, and it does call for a bit of a shift in kind of the security culture of the organization. But that's kind of what happens when we're moving past that and we're looking for that level of defense in depth, right? Because we're not really doing a perimeter. Wow, my words are just terrible today. Perimeter-based security, right? We're trying to do defense in depth, meaning that we have layers of defense at every turn. And so moving past that and getting into defense in depth does require things like the change made to get to zero trust. And so there is a lot of I think misunderstanding, I think, about that, especially as we, you know, try to explain these concepts to business leaders. And so sometimes it can be a little bit, I guess, confusing. Sometimes, you know, people are like, wait, so every single request has to be, you know, verified with what other, like, yeah, I understand that, but
yeah,
that's kind of what we're facing, right? You know, in the network, it is a big change because it, you know, you're not doing the trust but verify. You're not trusting and then verifying. So it can be a bit of a little bit of a burden, but it is definitely a very aggressive concept, like a mechanism to use. And I think it's extremely effective, but was also probably overused and oversold after some high level like supply chain attacks. You know, everyone was worried about, you know, their vendors or third parties being compromised in order to get to, you know, their data. So I think there was a little bit of overselling that in that kind of response to the rise and panic of supply chain attacks. But it is absolutely a valid technique. It just has to be implemented fully in order for it to really be as effective as it's kind of sold. And then obviously we can't talk about zero trust without explaining identity and how, you know, critical that is, especially in the cloud. Not that identity isn't critical outside of the cloud, but it's especially so. And kind of using that as its own boundary, you know, for its own security boundary, right? It's adding another layer, making sure, you know, oh, I have in-depth IAM identity practices that are allowing me to, you know, provide the level of access that I want for employees or admins or users or what have you, depending on your environment.
Yeah. For a specific time too. That's the other thing that people don't kind of realize. It's like, oh, I'll grant, you know, random person Russ, you know, access into the environment, but how long does Russ need access, right? Because it's usually a third party as well, right? Where you have the person's manager requesting access for Russ to the security person, or system, and now they're like, okay, granted. Now Russ goes onto a different manager or something along those lines. They might still have access, right? What are the systems and mechanisms in place? Just one of those interesting concepts to think about, right?
Absolutely. Actually, I did a while ago. So I think it was like sometime last year. I did have a case where they were using all of these principles and really were like quite hygienic with their identity and with their some of their security practices, but they had forgotten that they gave one of their summer interns an access key, and then there goes the access key, and there goes their entire account, because they were like, oh, it's an intern, we'll just give them admin for like the summer or whatever, but access keys don't expire. So
yeah, and that's an important part to consider when you should be, having a little bit of rotation and things of that nature, and it goes into that whole target state security strategy. But
definitely,
the other piece I would say is to your earlier point of when it comes to zero trust and why it kind of takes a little bit of a mind flip is because zero trust, you're rejecting the notion of trusted networks and devices and users, right? Usually you're like, okay, these are my devices, these are my users, trust them. And it's like, no, we're going to reject that. Inside or outside of VPC must be authenticated, right? And that's a real big thing, especially the way when you think of that traditional security approach. And that kind of goes down into everything else, to your point of identity and how we treat identity policies themselves, right? Because zero trust essentially acknowledges that the reality is you have to implement consistent controls throughout the network, not just at the boundaries itself. And the one piece I like to phrase it as is, hey, you have a house. Okay, if you grant somebody access into your front yard and your door is open, it's like, okay, they can come inside your house and go into any other room that they want, right? Because they already got past the front gate. But now zero trust comes in and says, okay, if I want to go from front door to living room, authentication. If I want to go to the kitchen, authentication. And it's just another way of making sure, one, you're kind of tracking where everybody's going, but two is, hey, you're checking in to make sure that's still the same person. They still have a purpose to go into the kitchen, because you might end up with an empty fridge if they don't, right? That's kind of
that's the these damn bears, man. So they're getting so smart. But yeah, but that's actually a great example, right? Of zero trust is like basically using like a lock on every door. But living in a house of locks can be a pain in the ass. If you have to authenticate and continue to do that, and you're trying to get to the kitchen, but you have to go through the gate, which you unlock, and then the front door, which you unlock, and then the living room doors, which you have to unlock, and then you know what I'm saying? And that's why I think that zero trust kind of has that eye roll buzzword implication, is because it can be a bit of a pain to implement properly. And so you have like kind of implement-ish type of, you take some of the ideas of zero trust and add to your existing mechanisms and way of doing things. So I think that's also something that kind of comes into zero trust a little bit, is understanding that it is a big change to how you do things traditionally, and so it can really affect the way that you architect your entire design.
Yeah, exactly. And these are the kind of things that you have to think about, especially when you come to least privilege. I always say it 3 times for the people on the other side of the internet. And then we also we'll consider put least privilege in deploying network infrastructure on only network team or admin to govern it. So this is where we get to the advanced part of the network design is this the appropriate path for divvying out your network, right? Because if you send everything to, let's say, the network team to govern it, what happens to identity, right? Because are you granting access for, let's say, small entities with the appropriate guardrails in place to spin up certain things, right? Can they open up VPC as long as they use A, B, and C, right? These kind of things that you have to consider. And you want to make sure that you have the appropriate mechanisms and guardrails in place. So the other thing that you want to make sure of is you learn from the past. And how do we learn from the past? Well, we go on a side quest, because the best way to learn is to go on side quests and build up experience points, 1 XP at a time. And today's side quest, as we start to chew our thematic theme, is going to be a continuation of our network security architect's journey. Because if you recall last week, they were part of a growing retail company, and they were tasked with establishing a secure network. Easy task. Something that they can, take care of.
Super easy.
But the company needed to connect to multiple store locations, protect customer data, ensure PCI DSS compliance. But say they got through that. Now, how do they take it to the next level? Because a security architect is facing increased scrutiny because their network is growing. So how do I redesign the network if I were that security architect in order to encompass all these compliance standards while growing as a business? I think this is an important part to consider, and the only way to do this is to dive right in to this side quest. So let us go and have the side quest with the side quest board. I was thinking of a good word to go, but I digress. As we start to go on this side quest, so let's think about it. We have our handy dandy side quest board, and for your first time joining us, what this is a visualization of how exactly we gather our authenticator, our security architect, building out the network design, and they have a bunch of blank space that they're trying to figure out what an appropriate path is for them. All right, so Russ, if where our network is expanding, if I were this security architect, how would you maintain control?
Oof, that's such a tough question because there's so many different answers. So I would say that there's a lot of different tools and services that we can implement to kind of maintain control. But basically that's all going to be within, our VPC. So like transit gateways and firewalls and, security groups, stuff like that. So I'm going to go with that. Those networking controls. I know there's a lot.
There's tons. Yeah, there is tons. And that's the big thing. It's not
a question with no answer. It's a question with all of the answers.
All the answers. And it wraps back around, surprisingly, right? Because if we look at how we do it, right? Because you can have VPCs, you can have private link established, right? You can have all these different pieces of the puzzle. But the thing that you have to consider is, from this person's viewpoint, is if they're dealing with a lot of retail locations and having to deal with, let's say, PCI DSS, the thing that they should consider is implementing mechanisms. And of course, it was the one piece that dropped. It, like WAF and the things of that were the firewall manager, because you're going to have an approach, and that approach can be centralized and decentralized, right? And I also say thank you, Dragunov, for the side quest board. And load balancer, that is also correct, because you have this distributed network, or centralized, depending on how you go about it. But you want to make sure that you have the appropriate mechanisms in place. So if we're trying to protect all of this and we're building out our network design, all right, so how do we continue this path? I think if I have PCI DSS requirements, I want something to aggregate all these different pieces. And that's where my mind, my heart, my soul goes to Security Hub, because Security Hub gives you that piece of the puzzle, right? Because think of the challenges that you have. You're managing east-west traffic with microservices, because you're a growing retail organization. So that means more applications and more containers, more things of that nature. Then you might also have that on-prem footprint still, right? So we think of private link because, hey, how do I, not expose the entire network while trying to communicate with the on-prem environment, right? So you might have some direct connection. You might have some other pieces of the puzzle. We talked about zero trust. You might have Amazon verified access for some of your users. But I think one of the main things is you want to maintain your compliance posture while enabling developer velocity. And that's where we're starting to go, because you want to have some mechanism to provide that strategic dashboard. And of course, I'm just going to throw guard duty on the board face up, because why not? Guard duty is a powerful tool that, it provides a bunch of different pieces of information to your overall security posture. But I think one of the pieces, and let me know, is what AWS network security control you think has the steepest learning curve for us? And I also pose this to chat as well. Hello.
That's a good question. I'd probably go with Security Hub. Well, I don't think that I have a good answer for that.
Yes.
What's your answer?
It's one of those things, because what you could do, right, is say if you have alerts coming in, it could be easy as something like, I don't know, Lambda, right? That could be a steep learning curve, because, hey, you have to put code to go inside your Lambda, right? But specifically to network security controls, it really boils down to how you're leveraging the different networking services. And I think one of the pieces where the steepest learning curve is, I think I would go with WAF, just for the fact of you want to make sure that each of the rules that you're putting into place has a purpose in a manner that doesn't, get you to certain limits or interrupt things, right? So I think dealing with web application firewalls, firewall manager, and how it manages network firewalls, to your point, all those services in there, pretty much anything that touches firewall manager starts to get, up there. But it all comes back to your plan. And I think that's where we want to understand, because when you think of the overall solution, let's say we stick with network firewall for a second. So you want to deploy your network firewall with something like domain filtering or IPS capabilities, right? That's one route that you can take for a solution to our challenges. Also, VPC endpoints and private link to eliminate the public exposure. And if we're speaking advanced, of course, advanced shield comes into play, right? So you want to think of all pieces of your overall cloud network posture, but you want to make sure that you capture, let's say, the compliance posture as well. So I pose this question to the chat. What AWS network security feature has delivered the most, let's say, unexpected value for your organization? It's one of those questions where when you stop and think about it, it's like, hey, that one is really doing a lot. And it could be something simple. It could be something like a VPC endpoint or a private link or something like that. Feel free to put it in the chat. But I think the other piece that we have to do is take that pause game, the Zach Morris timeout, as I call it, and take that step back, right, Russ? And let's kind of think about this for a second.
Yep.
We have this security architect, but it's not a rare use case that you still have on-prem and then you have the cloud. So now you have to start to think about, okay, how do I securely connect with the on-prem environment? So that's very important. As it's important as saying VPC private link, SSM agent. Thank you, Robert. And then One in Zillion says light sail. So I like the name, 1 in a zillion chance. But When you think of hybrid network security, where does your mind go, Russ? What do you have to start thinking of?
So I immediately think of, as we were discussing, our connection options, right? So connecting securely, we have to consider, especially for your use case and environment, customization, whatever. But in general, I'm thinking AWS Direct Connect, like a site-to-site VPN, and then wow, words are killing me. Like workspaces, like a desktop, managed desktop. And so there's definitely security considerations for each method. And then you also have to consider for compliance, encryption requirements, or cost considerations, because we like to be frugal here at AWS. And then, once we're talking about network security, especially connecting from non-AWS or non-cloud to on-prem, or AWS to non-AWS on-prem, we also have to look at the shared security responsibility model, which is big for me. Working on the incident response team, we have to deal with that every day. Because who is responsible for the security of the cloud and security in the cloud? And so there's definitely a lot of confusion with that. And so it is you also have to take into consideration what AWS's security of the cloud looks like when you're connecting your networks. So not just your on-prem, but also your VPCs and stuff like that. And so, AWS is going to control, for the most part, physical security and the infrastructure, whereas, in your design, that's more of data security, access management, the network configuration like we're discussing right now. So just also taking those into consideration, which I think doesn't get talked about a lot, but also in order to maintain that level of security, we also have to enact those policies, but then keep them consistent throughout say all of your multiple accounts. So talking about creating an AWS organization, implementing service control policies, IAM policies, and then your network security groups, ACLs, all that stuff. And so there's a lot of policies from that, and then you have like your configuration management tools, so like config, cloud formation, whatever policies you have in there that you want to keep consistent. And then of course change management, but that's a whole other episode, so I won't kind of get into that.
Well, so really quick on the point of consistent policies across environment. That's a very important part, right? To your point of shared responsibility model. You understand it when it comes to AWS, but you want to make sure you understand it, as you mentioned, to your local environment as well. You want to remember, okay, who does encryption, who does monitoring, access controls, right? All these items that you think of like, oh, they'll do this. No, of the cloud, in the cloud. You want to make sure you understand for all the different services used and the policy consistency. As you mentioned, so security fragmentation between on-prem and AWS creates blind spots, right? And inconsistency
Absolutely.
that attackers can exploit, essentially. So you want to make sure that you have that unified security policies. That requires a lot of orchestration, right? So you want to make sure that you're leveraging tools like network firewall and transit gateway to apply rules regardless of where a host is kind of, or where a resource is hosted, I should say, right? Because you want to create a seamless security experience, but also you want to maintain
that was a seamless microphone experience.
Yeah, so. Right? Exactly. So you want to make sure you do that. And then the monitoring of that traffic. So
oh yeah, I didn't even get into monitoring.
Yeah. that's a big thing as you start to go into that, because uh, monitoring cross environment traffic, right? You should have a heightened scrutiny when it comes to that, because think of VPC flow logs, network firewall logs if you're using that, traffic mirroring, right? They provide visibility into those flows, but you want to make sure that you have some centralized mechanism to track those logs. Think of Security Lake or third-party SIM, Splunk or QRadar, something along those lines to handle all of that. Right?
Definitely.
So, things to consider. What also you have to consider is what other polls do we have, and that is where we come up with the next poll. See, seamless transitions. So, a critical system must be accessed. What's your secure path in? Feel free in the chat, 1, 2, 3, or 4. And Russ, the choice is yours and yours alone. Which one?
I'm gonna go SSM.
SSM, agent-led provision, right?
Absolutely.
So when you start to understand and go through this, it's interesting, right? Because SSM, VPN, this goes back to who are you, right?
Yeah,
How are
exactly.
you looking? Are you the network person? Are you the developer? So why did you choose SSM?
I choose SSM because I think that is probably the easier way that's not true. Actually, probably workspaces would be the easiest way for your everyday user to be able to do that. But for even your like admins and SecOps not SecOps, DevOps and your cloud engineers, SSM is probably the easiest way. But you also have your more advanced users and people who want to just do your bastion and get in, get out, which is understandable. But I think when I'm talking about, when I want, say, how do I want my admins to be able to access a critical system? Preferably it'd be through that, rather than, just hopping on a jump box to a bastion. And so.
Yeah. And that's the funny thing is you have your classic approaches like jump box and the bastion, but then you start to think about VPNs. VPNs kind of are a classic approach too, right? Because we were just talking about zero trust, where you can use something like AVA, right? Amazon Verified Access, right? Or verified permissions in order for users to access your environment without going through the traditional client VPN experience, right? And having authentication every step of the way. Then that leads me down. This is my mindset of trying to choose one, right? It's like, okay, SSM and workspaces. Well, I would go SSM as well. I would go 2 because it's such a powerful thing where you have the agents installed and being able to command line in and a bunch of stuff like that. And we also have a question, or more of a statement. Low cost and light sale makes it easier for teams to experiment and sandbox their workflows for things like hackathons. Very easy to spin up and tear down. Thank you for sharing that.
That is a good point.
Yes. And always feel free to drop any tips, tricks, or things that you find useful within your approach to your environments, because it's an important thing to share. These are what side quests are for. This is why we are here, right? To go on these little nuanced little trails. So when we are going down the route of, all right, we have our network design, we have our hybrid understanding, we kind of understand the identity side, but the piece we really have to think about is as we start to have more serverless items, how do I handle this? Because if you're still in a traditional networking mindset, you might have some unique challenges when it comes to the modern architectures, right? Because serverless functions, they introduce ephemeral resources that may exist for seconds or minutes, and then they're gone, right, into the ether. So when you think of the traditional network approach, it's kind of ineffective in that sense. And you have to build in a way that you have their dynamic nature in mind, right? So when something is spun up, you want the security controls programmatically applied already, right? They're automatically scaled and they're they can be distributed very easily, right? So you want to make sure, hey, if you're using container, what kind of container system are you using? What is the OS, even going down to that? We're using something like Bottle Rocket, where it's security first from the OS layer, right? And then you start to think of the networking side of network isolation techniques, right? So containers often run on like a high density, let's say, shared infrastructure. So you want to make sure that network isolation is a main part of your strategy, right? So think of network policies, server mesh implementations, app mesh. There's a bunch of things that you need to understand especially when it comes to containerized applications themselves. And we also have one plane. Make the ephemerality part of the identity, which itself should be ephemeral, provided and reprovided identity. EC2 metadata are, yes, that is some good points. Thank you for making that. And that's a big part of when it comes to container is you want to make sure you get the identity down, right? Because depending on how you handle the identity is dependent on who can do what, right? And if you don't have a clear understanding of how you handle identity when it comes to containers, for lack of better words, you're going to have a bad time, right? There's a lot of stuff that goes into it. And reason why we like to call out, and one plain thanks for calling out, is identity plays a big part. And if you apply a policy a certain way, it can grant access that you didn't intend. So thank you again. Right? So the other piece is think of serverless, think containers. Now API protection. Another part when it comes to your network strategy that you might not be thinking of. When you get to the cloud, what is your API protection strategy? Because APIs are the primary entry points into modern architectures, right? And because of that, they have and demand specialized protection. And that's kind of why I went down the WAF route on our side quest, because WAF shields against common web vulnerabilities. API gateway, it throttles, authenticates, authorizes, but you want to think of different mechanisms like WAF and how you're going to use them. So the key to this is understanding how do I handle APIs in my environment? How do I handle serverless architectures? And I know what you're asking. Why didn't I like and subscribe so far to this channel? Because it's been awesome here. But also, how do I continue to dive into these different things, right? So the way I say to do this and what we encourage is build your aura. Go on some knowledge quests, right? And you might say, what is a knowledge quest? Well, it's those pieces that you may consider reading, you may consider workshops, you may consider just everything in general. And did that answer your question? No? Okay, I'll try again. So what it is essentially is getting to a point where you feel comfortable with AWS services, verbiage, meanings, definitions, things of that nature. So if we were to think about this and delve in, we spoke about in our last endeavor when it came to building Aura of, hey, what's the security best practices for your VPC? It's a good place to start, especially if you're just an explorer. You're L100. You're getting used to everything. You're building out the security groups and the knackles, right? You know, it's almost like making a pizza. Everybody can make a pizza, but all pizza is not created equally, and you could taste so. New York bias,
it's so true.
Just a New York bias a little bit too. But when you start to think about it, is you want to make sure that you understand, hey, how does a VPC work? How do I delve into this? And how do I plan for it? Because you can't plan for advanced architecture if you don't understand the basics. And if you're just starting out, hey, dangerous to go alone. Take a guide. Go through something like the security reference architecture. This is the building blocks essentially, and it literally has a page that says building blocks on it because it's such a great tool and page to go through and saying, hey, let me use the AWS organizations. Okay, what goes into that? How do I build the architecture out? And this goes step by step to say, hey, what does perimeter security look like? And this is how you explore. This is how you eventually level up to be an adventurer, right? Because you started to read and you start to figure out these different pieces of the puzzle. And then eventually you start to say, hey, how do I get to a point where maybe I consider other people's things, right? That's where you get to the blogs. And we spoke about this one last time, but I think it's an important concept to go over again, especially as an adventurer. The data perimeter is something that you should really dive into as an adventurer, because you start to get into building out and leveraging services in such a way that you're defining your boundaries, you're defining your permissions, and you're figuring out what services I need, right? So we talked about API being that gateway. So API calls performed by your identities on your resources. This might seem like, okay, that's a normal sentence, but what do you do with this information? And I think that's where you start to get into the perimeter conversation, right? And you start to think about deep dish pizza. Thank you, Drag. And then Spicy's asking for pizza as well. One of these days we have to have a pizza party. But
the Chicago deep dish is an insider threat. We have a trailer.
You got a trailer. It's like, well, we're gonna have to have a pizza topic. We gotta put that as a question. We gotta get.
We could do a whole episode on pizza.
Yeah, exactly. Speaking of pieces of the pie, see what I did there? API calls. API calls, right? You start to delve in. You start to figure out, how do I block? How do I maintain my network? Well, why don't you figure out, based on a workshop, hands-on, to figure out how you maintain your network is spin up a test network and see what happens when certain API calls are blocked, or how to block those certain API calls within your environment. And that's how you become an expeditioner, right? So you are prepared for the gooey, delicious threats, right? For the threats that come after, right? And this is one of the ways within this lab, right? You go through, you understand, hey, how do I create a firewall, some route tables, things of that nature. And then you can still go into foundational topics, especially when it comes to immersing yourself. It says it there in the title, but how do you handle one VPC, multiple VPCs? How do you just delve in and dive in? Because it's important to consider all of the facts. And that's why we had to zoom in. Because one, we started a thing with pizza that we have to continue. We're going to correlate this to some services.
This is absolutely
yeah, right. But also, there's important parts to this that, when you're starting out, you want to take all the pieces and eventually build out a pie to your own liking. And the pizza analogies are going to continue, because not all pizzas are created equal in a manner that fits your taste buds. And what do I mean by that is, hey, if you're a retail environment like our side quest, you want to build out in a certain manner that fits a retail, right? Certain compliance strategies, certain things of a response variety. I can't think of that thing. What is that thing that you have to have, especially in retail and all other organizations, Russ?
You're going to need an instant response plan. So please create one today if you haven't already.
Yes. Please create an instant response plan. And we also got to read
the rest. Also it's pizza time.
Yes, it's pizza time. And it's also time for us to go eat pizza. So until next time, thank you everybody for joining today. We appreciate everybody, and feel free to ping us about your favorite pizza toppings and security topics. So take care. Happy Monday. Bye.